My name is Nadia Reyes. I am 33 years old. On a Thursday morning in April, my father walked into the lobby of a building on 6th Avenue in Manhattan and asked the receptionist if he could see the managing director. The receptionist asked for his name. He gave it. She typed it into her system, then she looked up and said, "I'm sorry, sir, do you have an appointment?" He did not. He said he was family. She picked up the phone and dialed an extension. There was a pause. Then she said, "I'll let him know you're here." My father sat in that lobby for 43 minutes, and then my husband Marcus walked out of the elevator in a charcoal suit and said to the man who had not come to our wedding, "Hello, Gerald." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what happened in that lobby, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Soft Storm Stories. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me take you back 5 years, to the Saturday in June when my parents decided that love was a transaction, and Marcus and I were not worth the price of admission. I live in a 3-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. We have lived here for 2 years. The living room faces west, and in the late afternoon, the light comes through the windows and turns everything the color of warm copper. I keep a small jade plant on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. I have had it for 6 years. It was on the kitchen table of our first apartment, a 1-bedroom in Astoria with a radiator that knocked every night at 2 a.m., and a view of someone else's fire escape. This plant has moved with us 3 times. It is the most undemanding thing in my life, and I am grateful for it every morning. I wake up at 6:15. I make coffee. I sit at the kitchen table for exactly 20 minutes before the day begins. I am a licensed architect. I have been working for 7 years at a firm called Strand & Vela on 57th Street in Manhattan. Last year, I was named associate principal. I keep a small silver ring on my right hand. It was my grandmother's, passed to me the summer she died, the summer before I met Marcus. She pressed it into my palm and said, "Keep something that belonged to someone who loved you without conditions." I have worn it every day since. My parents, Gerald and Rosario Reyes, came to this country in 1987 with $800 and 2 suitcases. By the time I was born, they had built a small empire of determination. My father owned 3 dry cleaning businesses in Queens. My mother ran the books. They were not wealthy by Manhattan standards, but they were comfortable by every standard that mattered, and they wore that comfort like armor. They believed in status the way some people believed in God, completely, practically, as a daily organizing principle. Where you lived, what you drove, who you married, these were not preferences, they were measurements. I was the older of 2 daughters. My sister, Camila, was 3 years younger and had, by the time she was 22, married a periodontist from Westchester whose family had a house in the Hamptons. My parents attended that wedding. They paid for the flowers. My mother cried during the ceremony. My father gave a toast that lasted 11 minutes. I met Marcus Webb when I was 26. He was 28. He was finishing a master's degree in urban planning at Columbia on a partial scholarship and working 20 hours a week in a design firm in Midtown. He made $34,000 a year. He drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a crack in the dashboard that he had fixed with electrical tape and never bothered to replace. He was the most clear-eyed person I had ever met. He thought carefully before he spoke, and he meant every word he said. I brought him to my parents' house in Forest Hills for Sunday dinner 4 months after we met. My mother asked him where his family was from. He said, Ohio. She asked what his father did. He said his father was a high school history teacher. She nodded the way people nod when they are cataloging information rather than responding to it. My father asked about his career plans. Marcus said he wanted to work in city planning, specifically affordable housing development. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not a real career. "That's a hobby with a salary." Marcus looked at him. He said, "It's the work I want to do." My father looked at his plate. That was the first dinner. They got progressively shorter after that. We got engaged 2 years later. I was 28. Marcus had graduated and was working full-time at the New York City Department of City Planning. He made $54,000 a year. We had moved in together 6 months earlier into the Astoria apartment. I called my mother the morning after he proposed. She asked what kind of ring it was. I described it. Simple, gold band, small, round diamond. The kind of ring that says, "I chose carefully and I chose for keeps." She said, "That's very modest." I said, "I love it." She said, "Of course." The wound came 6 weeks before the wedding. I drove to Forest Hills on a Sunday in April. The cherry trees on my parents' block were in full bloom. I remember the pink petals on the sidewalk and the way the light was coming through them. I remember wearing a gray sweater and jeans and carrying a folder with the seating chart because my mother had asked to see it. My father was waiting in the living room. My mother sat beside him. Neither of them offered me coffee. My father said, "We've talked about it. We're not coming to the wedding." I sat with that sentence for 4 seconds. He continued, "Marcus is a good man, but he has no future. He works for the city. He will always work for the city. He will always make a city salary. You are an architect. You could have anyone. And you chose someone who drives a Honda Civic and talks about affordable housing like it's going to make him rich." He paused. "It won't." My mother said, "We love you, Nadia. That's why we're telling you the truth." I looked at my father, then at my mother. Then I picked up the folder with the seating chart and I put it back in my bag. I said, "Okay." I stood up. I put on my coat. I walked to the door. My father said, "You'll understand when you're older." I opened the door. The cherry blossoms were still on the sidewalk. I drove back to Astoria and I sat in the car outside our building for 18 minutes. Then I went upstairs and I told Marcus. He listened. He said, "Do you want to postpone?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay." He made tea. We sat at the kitchen table and looked at the seating chart together and moved 2 chairs from the parents' table to the friends' table, and that was that. We were married on June 14th in a small venue in Brooklyn, with 67 people and string lights and a cake that Marcus's mother made from a recipe that had been in her family since 1962. My grandmother's ring was on my right hand. A thin gold band Marcus had given me as a wedding gift was on my left. My parents sent a card. Inside was a check for $500 and 2 words, "Be happy." I looked at the check for a long moment. Then I put it in the card and put the card in a drawer. So we worked. That is the only word for what the next 5 years were. Marcus and I worked, separately and together, with the quiet, focused energy of 2 people who have nothing to prove to anyone except themselves. In year 1, Marcus was promoted to senior planner at the Department of City Planning. In year 2, he was recruited by a private development firm called Meridian Group that specialized in mixed-income housing development. He went from $54,000 to $94,000 overnight. In year 3, Meridian made him a director. In year 4, he was named managing director of their New York office. His salary at that point was $340,000, plus equity in 3 active projects. He drove the same Honda Civic until the transmission went at 187,000 miles, and then he bought a used Volvo because he said it was practical. He was right. I made associate principal at Strand and Vella at 32. My salary was $210,000. We bought the apartment on the Upper West Side in the fall. We did not tell my parents. We sent a change of address card with the new zip code. That was the extent of the announcement. A colleague of mine at Strand and Vella named Patricia had known us since the Astoria days. She was 10 years older than me and had worked in architecture in New York for 25 years and seen everything twice. She was the first person outside our marriage who knew the full shape of what my parents had done. She said once over lunch,
The interesting thing about people who measure worth by income is that they never see the correction coming. They're always looking at the starting line. I kept that sentence the way I kept my grandmother's ring, close and quiet. Marcus called me on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He said, "Your father came to my office today." I said, "What did he want?" There was a pause. "A loan," Marcus said. One of my father's dry cleaning locations had closed, a lease dispute, legal fees. He needed $85,000 to cover the gap. He had gone to 2 banks, both had said no. He had found Marcus's name in a business journal feature on affordable housing development in New York. He had not known, until that moment, what Marcus had built.
I said, "What did you tell him?" Marcus said, "I told him I'd talk to you." I could have said no immediately. I sat with it for 3 days instead. My mother called on the second day. She said Gerald was too proud to call himself. I said I knew. She said he made a mistake about Marcus, about what Marcus was. I said yes. She said he knows that now. I said I know he does. She went quiet. Then she said, very quietly, "He missed your wedding, Nadia. I missed your wedding." It was the first time she had said it that way, plainly, without reframing. I had the meeting on a Thursday. Marcus and I sat on one side of the conference room table at Meridian's office. My father sat across from us. He was 64. He looked smaller than I remembered. His suit was the same navy one he'd worn to Camila's wedding. He had a folder of documents. He placed them on the table without speaking. Marcus looked at the documents for 12 minutes. He asked 3 questions. My father answered each one carefully. Then Marcus looked at me. I looked at my father. I said, "Dad." He looked up. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly." He nodded. I said, "Do you understand what you decided 5 years ago and what it meant?" He looked at his hands. He looked at the documents. He looked at the table between us. Then he said, "Yes," just that, one word. It came out small and real, and without any of the machinery he usually used to protect himself. I looked at Marcus. He nodded once. We structured the loan with a formal agreement, drawn up by Marcus's attorney. Standard terms, 5-year repayment. I was not in the room for that part. I went to get coffee and stood at the window looking at 6th Avenue and held my grandmother's ring between 2 fingers and thought about cherry blossoms on a sidewalk in Forest Hills and a card with $500 and 2 words. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the first ring. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me, thank Marcus." She said, "I will." Then she said, "Nadia, your grandmother would have liked him." I stood in the kitchen with my hand on the jade plant on the windowsill. My eyes went wet for a moment, just a moment. Then I made dinner. My father has made 4 payments on the loan, on time, every one. He called Marcus directly each time. He has not asked for anything else. My mother came to our apartment for dinner in January. She sat at our kitchen table and asked about the jade plant, and Marcus told her the whole story of the Astoria apartment, and she laughed at the part about the radiator. I watched my husband make my mother laugh at our kitchen table, and touched my grandmother's ring, and said nothing, and that was enough. My parents did not come to my wedding. That is a fact that will always be true. Some absences cannot be undone. Some chairs that were empty on a day that mattered will always have been empty. I have made my peace with that not by forgetting it, but by building something so solid around it that the empty space no longer determines the shape of anything. Marcus and I are still in the Upper West Side apartment. He is now a principal at Meridian. I was named principal at Strand and Vela last month. The jade plant has 3 new leaves since February. I still wear my grandmother's ring every day. Here is what I know. The people who underestimate you are not wrong about your starting point. They are wrong about your destination. They see the Honda Civic and the city salary and the modest ring, and they draw a conclusion that makes sense to them in that moment. What they cannot see, what they are never able to see, is what is being built quietly, steadily, without announcement in the years they are not watching. Let them not watch. You keep building. If this story reminded you that the people who doubted you will one day need to sit across from a table with everything they underestimated, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe to Soft Storm Stories, and I will see you in the next one.